I would like to present our next speaker, Ib Hansen from Humana People to People. Welcome.
So, good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here with this group of friends who I experienced last night. Had a very nice socializing event together. It's good to see that so many people are involved in the same thing in this way, dealing with used clothing and doing recycling. I applaud you for that. It's fantastic. It's very good. It's good for mankind. It's good for the future that we do much more, especially in the situation we're now with climate change and global warming. I'm going to talk about the social impact from used clothes. And it said in the paper, I'm going to explain. I think it's a big word to use the word explain. I rather like the others where they're speaking or discussing. So it seems to put a bit of pressure on me. Anyhow, I also personally have a background with used clothing from Zimbabwe. I come from Zimbabwe, originally from Denmark. I've spent the last 34 years in Zimbabwe in retail shops. And I was in charge of setting up this retail shopping, and we had actually 16 retail shops spread all over the country, and were selling somewhere between 250 and 500 tons of clothes a year. What happened then in '96 was that the government introduced very high duties to protect the local textile industry. So we went out of business, you can say. Today, the situation is quite different. There has been a lot of economic issues in Zimbabwe, a lot of problems with the economy, pressure from the Western countries, and it's been tough going. So basically now, that industry that used to be there is gone. There is no textile industry in Zimbabwe. They even used to export. But because of this economic downturn, they went out of business. So the situation today is that there's a lot of Chinese cheap clothing, poor quality, dumped into Zimbabwe, including very cheap shoes. You know, you can buy 2 for $1, and then you walk around for 2 weeks, and then you realize there's nothing underneath. So you have to buy a new one for $2. And actually, the trousers I'm wearing from China, bought in Zimbabwe, in Harare, for $20. If you look at the situation, it would be great to start second-hand clothes sales again. First of all, because people in many places do not have access to cheap, strong clothing, but also because this Chinese clothing is actually not worth anything. So we'll be trying to see if we can set up again, but we're not sure. But maybe with your help, it will be possible. I was actually out here last year before, together with others for about a week, where we had what is called the Worldwide Gathering with other associations. We were out working to plant trees with the local communities. And it was a big experience for me and for others. We stayed out with the people in tents for about 5 days, and we planted almost 600,000 trees together with the community. But there I also realized that because of this economic situation, many people are actually having a hard time. And we came into some new settled areas where people were actually very poor. And we had this experience that we were sharing our food with the people when we had lunch. And there was one woman who actually kept the food that she was given, to bring back to the child. And later I saw her eating soil, you know, just to fill up the stomach. This is also part of the reality of where we work in some of the countries where we are. People are extremely poor, but they are hardworking, and you know, you all know the history of this country, and I'm going to explain a little about the background for Humana People to People by showing you also the historic background, so you'll understand where we come from. So where we come from? It's the concept of people to people. That is our concept from the very beginning. When UFF, that time in Denmark, called DAPP in English, Development Aid from People to People, was formed. And the whole concept was this, that ordinary people in Denmark and later in many countries in Scandinavia, Europe, United States, and so on, could be part of, as ordinary people, be part of doing something for other people around the world. So UFF was established in 1977 in Denmark, and during those years were also the years of a lot of tumult in the southern Africa and Guinea-Bissau. They were fighting for their independence against colonialism, and in our countries like Zimbabwe and South Africa against the system of apartheid. And there was a lot of people in Denmark, Scandinavia and Europe that wanted to do something. So we realized, a few of us, that it was actually a very small grouping of people that started DAPP in those years. I think some of the people who are here were part of that, including myself. And what happened is that we got connected to the people who were fighting for their independence in Zimbabwe, who were based in refugee camps in Mozambique. And we started to send used clothing and other machinery and trucks and so forth to the refugee camps in Mozambique. So our roots originally stemmed from that fight against colonialism and apartheid. That's where we come from. Ordinary people in our countries took up this challenge to support people in other parts of the world. Then in June 1980, after independence, we were invited to take part in the Reconstruction and Reconciliation and Resettlement, which was the slogan just after independence, to be part of reconstruction of the country. And a lot of volunteers were part of this in the 80s. Some of them sitting in here, I know, were also there, where we were building schools and clinics with the people in the very remote areas. And I want to show you some pictures from this period, just shortly. So this was what we call the UFF Scouts, which means it was a lot of children who were organized to be part of this movement of people supporting people in the southern Africa. And there were also those who collected clothing and led by some of the people from DAPP. And here, maybe it's not easy to see, but this is some of the trucks that were sent to the Mozambique camps in the 80s, or the 78, 79 period, before independence. And here was an event that was actually the beginning also of this, of collecting things, secondhand things. It was called the world's biggest flea market that was done in Sweden in those years to raise money for the projects in, for example, in Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and other countries in the southern Africa, and here they are selling clothes, knick-knack, all second-hand collected by some of those children and the adults in Denmark and Sweden. It was a major event, and a lot of people were part of organizing this. And then came the clothes bins. This is from UK, England, in the 80s, where this is how the containers looked that time. I'm sure they have been very much developed since. We have seen one outside the door here from Usagam. And then there were also established second-hand shops, which are still operating in the European countries. And this is a picture from Germany, where there were quite a lot of shops that time. Now we are in Zimbabwe, 1981. We were building a vocational school called Ponisai Vanu, which means serve the people in the local language, Shona. And this was a school for training youngsters in the vocational skills like you see here, metalwork, mechanics, textile, construction, and so forth. And this was, actually we started also some small industries. This was 1985. This was a small factory producing window frames from steel that was sold to companies in Zimbabwe. And that surplus from that was actually running the school, or paying the school fees for the students for a period of 5 years. And it was a good experience to learn how to make a commercial industry. Again, another example here is from Mozambique, where they're doing some carpentry, producing chairs and furniture. This is the last one where this is our international headquarters in Zimbabwe that you're looking at. The top picture there, it's in this side you can see the conference hall, and at the back what is called the tower. And there we have 40 to 45 people working on a daily basis to serve the members in the Humana People to People Federation of Associations. And that's where I'm based. Okay. So what is it that Humana People to People is doing? Initially, as you say, it was this starting in Zimbabwe with the reconstruction, and later we went into more long-term projects, development projects like teacher training. And it's, of course, a lot is based on the people-to-people's philosophy, where is the ordinary people in the Southern Africa who also themselves are working to improve their own lives together with us who came there those years. And today there is a lot of people locally who are part of the associations locally. For example, in Zimbabwe, there's a big group of Zimbabweans who are now running the association DAPP in Zimbabwe. But this has gradually built up over the years. So what areas are we working in? We're working in education and capacity training. We are working in rural development, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the poor. We're doing promoting health and fighting disease, and we're fighting climate change. And here you see the map is not very clear, but we are in 43 countries worldwide, reaching more than 13 million people. Mostly it's Asia, it's Southern Africa, Latin America, Central America, United States, the Scandinavian and European countries, where we have member associations. Today, in the world of education, we have 52 teacher training colleges in the Southern Africa. It's mainly in Mozambique, Angola, Zambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Democratic Republic of Congo. And then we are running a One World University, that is the member organization in Mozambique, called One World University just out of the capital, Maputo. And we have 9 children's schools and children's towns, 5 academies for working children in India, which is mainly for children that have been working and now getting a chance to study. You know, there's a lot of child labor in India. Then we have 8 schools of what we call the 2nd of May in Angola, 8 vocational training schools, adult literacy in Angola also for 100,000 people. And we are running 98 child aid projects with the national associations with 340,000 active households. And we have 243 farmers club training more than 80,000 small farmers. And 8 microfinance projects provided small loans to 14,000 rural women. And this last project type is in India. We are running 72 HIV/AIDS programs now. As I speak, it's a program called Total Control of the Epidemic. Reaching more than 6 million people is something I'm going to talk about more later. We have 23 HOPE and 5 community health agent projects reaching 500,000 people, and we have constructed more than 10,000 latrines in 2013. This is just a picture from the farmers clubs. But here we're also taking that into consideration that we are fighting climate change and global warming, as is necessary for people to take up this very huge, I can say, they're facing a very difficult situation with the climate change and global warming, especially in our African countries, where we can always see the impact of this climate change. The temperatures are rising, and it becomes more and more difficult to do farming. We experience a lot of droughts in southern Africa. We have experienced floods in Mozambique and in other parts of the southern Africa. So some of the countries are hard hit already by the consequences of climate change and global warming, and we have to do something about it. So therefore we both advocate for what to do to try to mitigate the effects of climate change and global warming. And one of the things that is very good here is the Farmers Club, who are doing a lot of work to grow more food without using fertilizer and chemicals. Also, as I said, we were doing this last year. The member associations were having a campaign, planting trees, and we actually planted about 14 million trees last year. So now we come to part of this also with what you are doing. The members continue to collect second-hand clothes and also reuse and recycle it to also minimize the emission of greenhouse gases. And I heard that you have big volumes of clothing being collected in the United States and Canada. And I can hear that there's still a lot to do. If only 15% are being collected as of now. It is massive. It is massive tons of clothes that is moving around and being wasted. Yeah, Farmers Club addresses these questions. And these are also the people that are hardest hit by climate change and global warming. So we got to do more. What they do with Farmers Club, I think you heard last year from one of my colleagues from Malawi, who were explaining about the Farmers Clubs. It's a very, very good concept that the farmers are being organized together to improve their standard of living by producing food, at least for self-sustainable life. In child aid, we're also dealing with this issue. Here we have solar energy that are being set up. And then I said planting trees. We have established what is called a climate center at a school in Zimbabwe, which is called the Frontline Institute. This is where we're training Humana staff from the member associations from Asia, Latin America, Central America, and also from Africa to be project leaders of tomorrow. And they have actually established now a climate center around the school where they work with the locals to build firewood-saving stoves, to set up simple solar energy production that heats the water. And they're also doing a lot of tree planting with the people in the areas where we are. Coming to the clothes, I totally agree with you. It's an ingenious model for caring for the environment and creating the necessary change that needs to take place, and not all this waste and dumping of clothes that is having a very big negative effect on climate change and global warming. So I think you know, from your own, you know this chain of how we are doing the clothing. I don't have to explain, I think, in detail. But it's a very important part of the income for the members of Humana People to People. In the years in the 80s and 90s, it was actually constituting about 80% of the income for running the projects in the Southern Africa. And today, of course, it's still it's the growing thing every year. But at the same time, we also have a lot of funds coming in from bigger partners through what is called the partnership offices in our countries and in Europe as well. And it's actually a very important part. But without the clothes, it would be difficult for us to implement some of our programs, because we can also see now that the donors and the partners are putting more and more demands to what they want to get out of these funds. So with the money from the clothing, we have more free, you can say, possibilities of doing the concept that we think are the right ones. Because that money does not have, well, it's more free funds, you can say, that can be used for the development projects. Yeah, you know the collection bins, I don't have to explain much. The sorting centers and the shops from Humana. Yeah, I think you know the cycle of this clothing. So again, the importance of the clothes is very obvious. It's protecting our environment by recycling. It creates a lot of workplaces, and you do create a lot of workplaces in your work. Thousands of jobs are created. A lot of people in our countries get an opportunity to do business and provide very good quality clothes and cheap clothes to the people. And then again, we use the funds for the projects to change the lives of the people to the better. I want to just say that, of course, for example, in a country like Mozambique, which is maybe one of the places where we have the biggest clothing, the second-hand clothes production, we are actually providing clothes for almost more than half of the population of Mozambique. And if that clothes was not there, they might not have any access to the clothing. So it makes a very huge difference. And it also creates a lot of employment. We have direct employed 400 people in the second-hand clothes and shoes. And we have about 4,000 people who are customers of this of the wholesale who are also making a living out of this. So it's not small, it's not something that should stop, it should actually escalate. According to the United Nations, now you talked about how much clothes is actually being consumed by individuals in the United States. And I think you mentioned something like 67 something. Yeah. But average per person is about 62 garments and some 7 shoes in annual. In Mozambique, for example, the people of Mozambique on average have 5 pieces of clothing per person per year. It tells you something about the magnitude of the difference between the Western world and the African world and the Asian world. According to UN, a person should have about 20 pieces of clothing per year to have a decent life. So you can see here that the Mozambicans are actually missing 15 pieces per person. And this is the same picture in many of the other countries where we are. And this disparity is what you are also working on changing, which is very, very good. Now I wanted to say something about a program that is a mass mobilization program called Total Control of the Epidemic. You all know that HIV/AIDS had a devastating impact on people's lives where we are in Asia, in Africa, and where we are in the Southern Africa, it has been quite a struggle to start to gain some control of this. From our own perspective, we developed this program in the 1999, which was a way of systematically reach every single individual with information and mobilization to make them aware, make people aware, ourselves aware that you can actually make a difference and stop the infection of the virus yourself. In year 2000, some of us went to Botswana to start a program. We were invited by the president of Botswana at that time, President Mogae, who wanted to save a lot of people in his country from the infectious virus. And when we arrived there to set up Humana National Organization in Botswana, some places where we were, the prevalence rate was above 50%. So you can imagine a population where half of the adult people are infected with HIV. What that means for the future of such a country. We set up the program, which is based on, we employ field officers in an area of 100,000 people. We employ 50 locals and train them to be able to go house to house, person to person, and inform, educate, mobilize them and us to take control of the virus in individuals and also in communities and families. So we had, within 9 months, we had established this systematic approach in a population of 900,000, which was about half of the people of Botswana, covered by field officers going door to door, person to person, for a period of 3 years. This was the time when there was no ARV, when we started. And actually it was devastating to be part of this struggle because a lot of people died in those years, especially young people. I can just tell you from a small town called Palapia, we had 30,000 people in that small town. Every Saturday, we buried 12 people from that village who died from AIDS. There were 4 cemeteries in that small village, and there were 3 to 4 funerals every Saturday. Mostly, if you looked at the gravesite, it was young people of 19 to 25 years of age. Very, very, very tough period. But then came the ARV, and we mobilized the people to get to know their status, taking the HIV test, getting on ART, and it made a huge difference to the number of deaths immediately was changing. But at the same time, a lot of new infections occurred. And I know today there are still too many infections in our countries in Southern Africa. In 2012 alone, there were 400,000 new infections in South Africa in 1 year. And now there are 6 million people infected in South Africa, of which only 2 million are on ARVs. This is the reality of what we are up against. But we have seen change, big change, over the last 20 years, and especially the last 10, where the new incidences are dropping, but we still have huge populations on treatment, which is a very costly affair. You can imagine if you have a population like South Africa, eventually with 6 million people on drugs for the rest of their lives, and these drugs are not cheap. They're expensive. So the way forward is to stop the spread of HIV, which we are doing with this program. But I will also tell you another experience from Botswana, which I had. I was together with one of the field workers for 1 day going around to house, and we get into this small house where the woman was sitting on the bed with a child, and on the bed was lying a man who we could hardly see was alive. He was obviously infected with HIV virus and at a very severe stage. So his weight had dropped from about 50 kgs to 30. And probably his situation was as he was going to die within a very short time. And then this woman was sitting on the bed and crying. And we said to ourselves, we have to do something. So at that time, the ARV was actually in place in Botswana. But because the man was sick, he could not even walk, and the woman didn't know what to do. She let him lie there on the bed and could not do anything about it, because there was about some 2 kilometers or so to the hospital. So we carried the man to the hospital and got him on treatment. And I know that 2 months later, he was up and working. So this is how huge an impact the drugs has on a person with HIV. It can actually turn around in a very, very short time. So it's like a miracle to look at the number of people that go back to normal work and because of the ARVs. But there is a severe shortage in most countries of the drugs. And of course, it's a constant fight. But today there are many on drugs, many on treatment. But as I said, there are still many who get infected. So we need to continue our efforts to fight HIV and AIDS using what we do together with many other organizations and the governments in the countries where we are, with support of the international communities. So the TC model is a march-line approach. I'll show you the map where we have implemented the program and where we are right now. But as I said, we started in year 2000, and we can see a lot of results and achievements of this program. So the whole philosophy is that only the people can liberate themselves from AIDS. That was our point of departure. If we want to get in control of this, it's the people who have to take control. Nobody else can. So the health system in our countries, or many countries, are not really up to the task. So that's also another reason why is the people have to act themselves to take control of this virus, which is possible because it's 100% preventive, as you know. So we had trained a lot of field workers to move around house to house, person to person, and make people take control and act upon HIV in the whole of Southern Africa. There's a very efficient management structure in this program, which also is necessary in this situation because we have to act fast. So each population, for example, of 100,000, we have 50 field workers moving house to house. And then we have what we call a division, which consists of 5 troops of 250 field officers covering a population of 500,000 people. And this program is very efficient, it works, and we can see the results from it. So as I said, the field officers are recruited and trained to implement the program, and they go house to house for 3 years, constantly meeting the individuals in the households, mobilize them to get an HIV test, and get them on treatment when they're tested positive, mobilize pregnant women to go for antenatal clinic, and if they're positive, to do what we call prevention of mother to child, which also is to give them the drugs. That means that the child will not be infected if the mother is HIV positive, and also give the child the drugs when born. It's very much organized it's like a military setup. That's why we use these words: troops, division, patrol, because it's efficient. And then every week, the 50 people, they meet and discuss their experiences of how to deal with this epidemic. And of course, it can be very tough to do it. So it's very important that we stick together in order to keep going and not getting affected by the reality that is there on the ground. So we refer to health services to get people on drugs, as I said, also for other health services, provision of condoms. We ensure that we have the test kits to test the people. We do a lot of referral for TB treatment, immunization, cholera campaigns, malaria campaigns, because there are field officers all over the place. It's very easy for the Ministry of Health to use them when there's some kind of outbreak of polio, for example. They can go and vaccinate people in a very short time. Yeah. There's a lot of things that has evolved over time that with the experience of the virus that can help to suppress the virus. Of course, still the only way to avoid infection is by using condoms. And therefore we also distribute a lot of condoms, which you'll see later. As of now, this is what we have done and are doing. We are operating in 12 countries: Angola, Botswana, DRC, Guinea-Bissau, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, India, and China. And we have implemented, or are implementing, about 200 areas of each 100,000 people. So we are reaching approximately 18 million people over time. And as of now, if you look at this, this graph shows you where we have completed the areas. These are the blue, and the green ones are where we have operated. So after 3 years, you can see in year 2000 we started 3 areas, and in 2003 we completed those 3 areas. So all in all now we have completed 113 areas over this last 14 years. And right now we are implementing 72. We can also see it's a gradual increase year by year, reaching now almost 7 million people as I speak today. We have what we call the main figures that we deal with. One is that we have said we are going to talk to every single individual of the 100,000, and at least 2 or 3 times a year, the field officer is going to talk to that individual to make the change that is necessary. And here you can see that we have now visited and registered 4 million people within the program. And here, the number of people tested is now up at 3 million, which is quite a tremendous figure. Condoms, we have distributed 300 million condoms to the people in those 12 countries. And this is a big undertaking, both to secure them, but also to get them distributed and get people educated how to use them. So when the field officers are mobilized, they actually show the people how to use the condoms. It's not just to give out condoms, because you have to use them correctly. And it's both female and male condoms they are distributing. We had figured out that if you wanted to avoid infection in an area of 100,000, we had figured out that we need to distribute 30,000 condoms a week in a population of 100,000. And that is based on a survey that was made in Zimbabwe on the number of sexual intercourse that people have within a week, if in a population of 100,000. 30,000 condoms in a week in every single area that we are working in. And this we have done in many cases. Some cases we have problems to get the condoms because they're not there, which seems to be very strange because condoms is very cheap and it's the most efficient prevention, or actually the only prevention that prevents 100% the infection. But this has to do with logistical problems locally, or the condoms are not in the country at the time, or I mean, it's not just like that to get 30,000 condoms out to people in rural areas in these countries every week throughout the year. At the same time, we mobilize local volunteers to set up condom outlets. So in an area of 100,000, in an area of 2,000, which is one field officer's area, 2,000 people, we have up to 50 or more condom outlets run by local people who are we calling TCE passionates, who are then distributing the condoms to the people. Here we have what we are trying to do is when the field officer is there in the household talking to individuals face to face, and the reason they do it one-to-one is that the people well, you all know that you're not just explaining your own sexual affairs to a foreigner or a stranger. So what they do is they talk to individuals. First, they go to each individual and they talk to them about the risks that they are taking in concerning HIV. And then they build up a trust with the individual over a period of time. They build a trust so that people open up and say, my problem is like this and this and this. I have my wife, but I also have a girlfriend, or I have my husband, but I also have a boyfriend, and then we discuss, okay, what should we do then? Some they visit the sex workers, and there's a lot of issues surrounding this, which is hard to deal with for the field officers. But they are amazing people. I mean, they work very hard, and they actually build up that trust to people actually open up, and they say their risks, and they make a plan. The field officer come back and say, so have you done what you should do, or how is the situation now? Eventually they get the whole family to open up to each other. You know, if one is HIV positive, the other one is negative. it creates a lot of complications in the family. But they deal with these issues. Eventually, they want them to be compliant, which means they're in control of HIV and AIDS. And here you can see up to 9 million people have declared themselves that they are in control, out of the 18 million that we have talked to. Pregnant women, it's very important that the pregnant women get to the antenatal clinic and get on treatment when they're positive. And here are the number of volunteers that we have mobilized 1 million people to take part in this fight in those 12 countries who are doing something for the people in the area, either distributing condoms, finding people, screening TB for people for TB, helping them to stay on the drugs, because you have to take the drug every day. This is also a big issue, that people sometimes stop because they feel better and then they stop, and then it has a very negative impact because now we have multiple resistant drugs, MDR drug it's called in South Africa, where the drugs simply don't work anymore. Yeah. This is a picture from a big gathering we had some years back. We had gathered 1,700 field officers for a 3-day meeting in Mozambique. They came from all over, China, India, Angola, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and it was a great event. You can see here they're all uniformed, so they are very visible in the community. Picture from South Africa, where the people are being mobilized to take control. And here, you cannot see it, but they're weighing a child in the clinic, and the field officer is following that to ensure that the child is growing up healthy. Here you see a typical picture of how we operate. This is Namibia. There are a lot of ponds in the northern Namibia, a lot of water, and sometimes the field officers simply go right across instead of going around because it's faster. So they up with the sleeves on the trousers and then walk across the water and get to where they want to go. And they sometimes walk 10 kilometers a day to reach people. Here are some of the patients. And this picture is from India, where he's now taking blood to see if this person has HIV, sorry. And this is from China, where we're also doing the program in the Yunnan province in southern China, where there's a lot of problems with HIV because of drug use. It's quite devastating to see. This picture is from South Africa, from informals. A lot of people live in shacks, and of course there the situation is not okay in terms of HIV and health. Here this is from the same event where the people are gathered, all the field officers. And here he's talking to a truck driver. Some of the people that are hard hit is also truck drivers because they go long distance and they find sex workers on the way. And if they don't protect themselves, then the sex worker infections occur. Here she's demonstrating a female condom to a man. It's not very easy to convince the men to use condoms. So sometimes the women do not have a say. And this is a fight. Sure, we are doing home-based testing in most of the countries now. This is from Zambia, where we are testing people in their houses. Yeah. This is the last picture. You can see a field officer carrying the bicycle. This is how they work. They don't stop for anything because they want to change the situation in the countries where we operate. This was the last picture, and Lisa said, I have no more time. But I would like to sing a song. if I'm allowed to, in our local language in Zimbabwe called Shona. This is a song from, you can say, during the Liberation War, which was tough times for many Zimbabweans in the refugee camps in Mozambique. So to keep up the morale, they were singing. They hardly had anything. There was no food. There was no water. They were attacked by helicopters and jet from above, from Rhodesian forces, and killed. But this song is also a song that we're singing fighting the enemy. And I think some of you in here know the song from long back in the 80s. It's called Dofira Zimbabwe, which means dying for Zimbabwe. That was the reality. Do famba, do famba, do famba, Dofira Zimbabwe, inyika ya baba isina nenamo, Majaya musachi, kurvisa mabunu, Zvinoda masimbi, kurvisa mabunu, Mandara musache, kurvisa mabunu, Zvinoda vasimbi, kurvisa mabunu. Hey wena, 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 you, 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 you. You, 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 you. Do famba, Dofira Zimbabwe, inyika ya baba isina nenamo. You can hear it's a sad song.